Hi, good afternoon. This is Bushra. I'm an immigration attorney, and today I'm going to be doing a video regarding 5 things to understand about your asylum interview. I work in Southern California in Huntington Beach. We practice in the area of asylums. We've been doing asylum cases for the last 11 years, and we've done a number of interviews in our office here. A vast number of interviews, bordering almost 1,000 interviews, where we got experience with different asylum offices all over the country, and we got to understand more and more about how asylum interviews are conducted and what's the purpose behind them. So I want you to understand 5 things about your asylum interview, and I feel like if you understand these 5 things, you would be able to have a very successful interview, and hopefully you'll find protection and safety here in the United States. The first thing that I want you to understand is that you need to understand what's the purpose behind the interview. A lot of people think that the purpose behind the interview is just to say your story and to tell the person about what happened. But the number one thing that these interviews are about is something called credibility. Whether you're credible, whether I can believe you or not, okay? Credibility is more than just you reciting a story. Credibility is in the way you recite the story or tell them about what happened. Credibility is in responding to questions in a direct way versus, going around without being in an indirect way. So for instance, in a lot of Middle Eastern cultures where I come from, instead when we ask somebody, where's your ear from, the joke is that they tell you, this is my ear, versus when they're supposed to be saying that this is my ear, which is the easy way. And so sometimes the lack of being direct affects your credibility with the officer, that the officer feels, okay, are you hiding something from me? Are you not telling me? Okay, what's the story, or what's the deal here? Is that why you're not being straightforward with me? So be careful if you're not being straightforward, and that's one of the things that our credibility is being assessed. So the first thing that you have to understand that the asylum interview is about is that it's about assessing or understanding your credibility. Meaning, okay, that if I don't find you credible, okay, I am not going to grant you. And if I find you credible, there's a big chance that the officer will grant you, because they will think that this is a person who was really harmed and he's told me about their harm. The second thing that I would like you to understand also about your asylum interview is that understand that how the asylum interview itself works. Okay, the asylum interview is usually done in an office, and in that office there's a desk. There's 3 chairs in front of the desk. There's a computer screen behind the desk, and there's the officer sits behind his desk. On the chairs in front of them, and it's facing the officer, you'll have an interpreter. You're going to have the client themselves who are testifying about their case, and their attorney. Okay, the officer is the person who's conducting the interview. This is not a court, so your attorney doesn't have a big role, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about the role of attorney next. The officer will tell you that the interview is going to be conducted in 3 parts. The first part is a review of your asylum application. They want to look at your asylum application and see if the asylum application is correct. The application is called an I-589. It's an application that has your name, your date of birth, the names of your family members, brief description about what happened, why you're asking for asylum. So the officer is going to review this with you. The second part in the interview is going to be asking you in a question and answer session about why you left your country and why you're afraid to go back to your country. And then the third part and the final part is that the officer will inform you, okay, of how you're going to be receiving your decision. They're going to give you a piece of paper to say, come back, okay, for instance, in 2 weeks to pick up a decision, or we're going to mail it to you, okay? You have to understand that during the interview, the officer is typing everything that is being said. He's even typing, or she's even typing, the silent interactions that happen between you and your attorney, for instance. So if you start looking at your attorney to get some hints from him or anything like that, he's going to be typing that. It's going to be part of the notes and the record of your case. You got to understand that in the interview, okay, the point of the interview is not to have you recite what happened with you. Just say, oh, go in and just say everything that happened to you. No. The point of the interview is to ask you questions and to hear your answers. And if the answers make you sound credible and that you are credible, the officer will then go ahead and grant your case. Now, one of the things that you need to understand also, so we talked about understanding the purpose of the interview, we talked about the understanding how the interview is being conducted, but the third thing that you need to understand is to understand what's the purpose of your attorney if your attorney goes with you, okay? I do not recommend you doing asylum interviews without an attorney. The attorneys play a very important role inside the interview, different than what people think they do. So people think that the attorney's role is to answer questions instead of them. That's not true. Okay, the attorney's role inside the interview is to act as a gatekeeper, to protect you if an officer does something wrong. So, for example, these interviews by law should be something called non-adversarial, meaning that they should not be somebody who's trying to make you do a mistake. They should not be repeating the questions. So by law, for instance, the officer cannot be asking the question repeatedly just because he doesn't like the answer. He just wants to have you change the answer. If you go by yourself or you only take an interpreter with you, you and your interpreter will have no right to tell the officer, "Hey, officer, stop asking the same question again. The applicant has already answered the question." No, the attorney is the only person in that room that is able to tell an officer not to do that. The other thing that the attorney does to the officer is they let the officer understand, okay, that this client has somebody who's going to defend them if something goes wrong. And this is a psychological point that gets across to officers, and it makes them, I think, more vigilant of making sure that no lines are being crossed. Listen, the vast majority of asylum officers are excellent people. They're wonderful people. They're well-trained people. Okay, there are, and like in any other organization, there could be a number of officers who are not good, and they can harm you in the end. And that's why you take an attorney. You don't take an attorney because you're going to end up with a great officer. You take an attorney because there's a chance you might end up with an officer who's not a good officer. Okay. The attorney in the interview can also ask questions at the end of the interview. So if there was some questions that the officer intentionally did not ask, or the officer did not cover in his questions with you, the attorney can go ahead and ask some of those questions to you to clarify it, and the officer is required to type out these answers. Okay. The attorney also at the end of the interview can explain the issues. Okay, they can explain certain things to the officer that the officer is not seeing. And finally, the attorney can also see things that you're not seeing. The law, answering questions in the law is not a one-time thing. Meaning that when we ask questions as lawyers, we ask questions like Lego bricks, brick by brick by brick by brick. We build the building. Okay, and when we do that, sometimes as a lawyer, as I'm sitting there, I can see where the officer is headed with their questions. So I can sense that, for instance, they're going into territory that could be a problem for my client, or a territory they're not supposed to go to. Okay, and in that context, okay, if I can see it coming towards my client, these questions, I can stop it and say, "Hey, officer, why are you going through this route? Why are you trying to make this into my client? Why are you asking these, for instance, questions that are not appropriate to my client?" Okay. You gotta also understand that a lot of the work that is done for lawyers, by lawyers, should be done outside of the asylum office. Meaning, if you are going to meet your lawyer, okay, who's going to read about your case for the first time and everything like that, for the first time in the asylum office, and you're going to be working, for instance, with an interpreter all along or something like that, and not working with somebody from that law office or that lawyer specifically, okay, that's not a good idea. Okay. The role of the attorney is vital in the interview, but it's not that big. The bigger role, okay, is outside. It's preparing you. It's reviewing your declaration. It's making sure that certain things are mentioned and certain things are not mentioned unless you ask about them. Okay, so the main work that an attorney does in an asylum case, okay, is sort of like a protection, like a guide to make sure that you don't go into territories that could end up harming you. The fourth thing I would like you to understand about your asylum interview, especially if you're doing it in a foreign language, okay, is that there is a difficulty in having these interviews with an interpreter. There is an interpreter that you can take with you to your interview, and nobody's going to hold this against you. Even if you know good English, but you choose to do this in your native language, it's your right 100%, and no officer is going to use it against you. Some people prefer to do it in their native language because the problems that they faced, for instance, that they had been summoned by the police in their country, was done in their native language, and so they want to make sure that this native language, are questions, or the questions that they get asked, they can easily say it in their native language and have it translated. The problem is that when you work with an interpreter, there are certain cultural and historical meanings that usually end up being lost in there. Okay, there's things that you assume in your culture are understood by you saying one word, but they need to be dissected or they need to be expanded on if you're going to talk about them. Okay, in your interview. Okay, and so that's one of the problems with the interpreter. So sometimes you can get some questions you feel like, why is the officer being so silly, asking such a silly question? It's not a silly question. It's just that the officer, you said something to the officer, you assume that you're going to understand immediately. Okay, but but for instance, they are not going to understand immediately. So, for example, you say something along the lines of, I was walking during Ramadan, okay, and all the restaurants were closed, okay. You are asked, why were the restaurants are closed, okay, and if you live in an Islamic country, for instance, okay, you'd say the restaurants were closed because it was Ramadan, okay. So that's where interpretation, okay, could have a meaning that, our cultural meaning, our historical meaning that is lost just because you said it's Ramadan. If I understand your language, or if I understand where your culture is coming from, the way when you say Ramadan, I understand immediately that restaurants are closed during that time, okay? Whereas the officer, because of the fact that it's being translated to them, okay, would not get that cultural or historical understanding or context. The other problem that we have sometimes with interpretation is that if you speak some kind of English, you might not like some of the words used by your interpreter, and that you can get picky. I remember having an interview where somebody was describing a car, and they said the color was burgundy, and the interpreter said it in the Arabic language. I speak Arabic, and so they said it in the Arabic language, burgundy, okay, but the interpreter translated it into red, and the applicant got into an argument with the interpreter about why he translated it into red. I said burgundy, and the interpreter did not, got upset, and the applicant got upset, and it was a very ridiculous thing. The problem is that it did not matter. Red from burgundy did not matter. It wasn't such a vital thing. And so if you know some English, gotta keep in mind that when you use an interpreter, they might interpret things in a little bit different way than you. Okay. You gotta understand that when you're doing interpretation in the asylum office, when your case is being interpreted, you have somebody on the phone. They call somebody on the phone called the monitor. The monitor reviews or makes sure that the translation is doing correctly. So he listens to the whole interview and makes sure that the translation is going correctly. Okay. Now, I get a question that says, what if I speak some English? Can I answer in English? If you speak some English and you choose to do your interview in your native language, you have to answer in your native language. I've seen officers being okay with you giving some answers in English. But what I have not seen is officers being okay with answering questions, okay, that are asked in English before they're being interpreted in your language. So what happens is that a question is being asked, where were you yesterday? And you immediately say, I was at home, okay, wasn't waiting for the translation, okay? The officers hate that, okay? They want to make sure that you understood the question, so they want to make sure that that question was asked to you and it was interpreted to you. If you respond in English after the question was interpreted to you, most of the time they're okay with it as officers, okay? As I always say, there's a value to your attorney knowing your language, your native language. It's as if there's another set of ears in the interview, making sure that everything is going correctly in the interview. So we talked about understanding the purpose of the interview. We talked a little bit about understanding how the interview looks, or what's the three parts of the interview. We talked about the purpose of the attorney in the interview. We talked a little bit about the difficulty of working with the interpreter. The last thing is that I want you to understand that your case, your asylum case, is more than an interview. A lot of people put a lot of bank on the interview, saying that this is the most important thing in the case. But I want to tell you that there is more to your asylum case than your interview. There is the kind of declaration that you wrote. Is it something that's comprehensive? Does it make sense? Does it convey the information correctly? Is it written in proper English? Does it get the data correctly out there? There's also the fact that, what's going on with the country conditions that you're coming from? Is there current country conditions to show that there's problems in your country or that you might be harmed? Okay. Even the interpreter they use could be also have an effect, on your interview. If the interpreter is known to be somebody who has integrity, who does not change words or something like that, that always helps the officers. Same thing with the attorney. Okay, so these things, just you gotta understand that the case is like a wall. It's built by different bricks. Okay, it's not only about your answers. Okay, it's not about how the interview is conducted. It's not about you whether you cry in the interview or not. Okay, there's more to the interview than just that. There's more to your case than just the interview. Okay, and so please understand that even if you have not so great interview, that doesn't mean there's no hope for your case. I've seen cases that have really bad interviews, and by the end, through questions and through talking and through explaining things, these things have changed in the end, and we were able to convey the right message to the officer. I hope that this video will be helpful for you in understanding 5 things that you need to understand about the asylum interview, and I wish you best of luck in your immigration process. If you need us for any services, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.